As soon as I realized that I wasn't going to make it home before dark, the anxiety set in. I felt like I had swallowed a weight. The feeling was heavy in the pit of my stomach. I picked up my pace as the darkness began to swallow my surroundings, and took a few deep breaths in an attempt to calm my nerves, but it did very little to help, and I felt like my heart was going to jump out of my throat. I switched my keys from my left hand to my right, and wiped my sweaty palms on my leggings, and wiggled my hands and fingers to try to dry some of the sweat. The sound of a stray cat jumping onto a garbage can made me flinch in fear. I stopped as the cat crossed my path and looked around the street. There didn't seem to be anyone around, and I couldn't decide if that was a good or a bad thing. On one hand, there was no one around to do anything, so I was safe in a way. On the other hand, if someone did suddenly show up, there was no one else to help me. I was just starting to enjoy my walk. The weather was actually perfect for this time of year, and I was beginning to feel a bit at peace, when I noticed the truck. It was devastatingly easy to miss, and I tried not to think about what might have happened if I hadn't noticed it. The windows of the truck were tinted. The headlights were off, and every few seconds the truck inched forward down the street in my direction. For the time being, I was still quite a few feet away, but the reality of the situation was that there was no way I would be able to outrun a truck, and I started to wish there had been someone else on the street. I was still about 10 minutes from home, but I started to plan my next move. There was no way I could go home right now anyway, not with this person following me. The only thing worse than them following me down a random street was them following me straight to my house. I switched my keys back to my left hand and wiped my right hand on my leggings. The anxiety was starting to creep in once again, and all I could hear was my heart pounding in my ears as I periodically looked behind me, trying to keep an eye on the truck. I watched as it pulled over in front of a shop and the engine turned off. I felt relieved for a second. Maybe I was exaggerating, and the driver was looking for the shop all along. I took a few deep breaths and kept walking. I glanced back once again to see a man get out of the truck. Instead of going into the shop, though, he headed down the street, directly towards me, taking a quick glance up and down the empty street. I began walking even faster as he jogged across the street. "Hey!" he called. I ignored him and gripped my keys tighter as I tried to plan my next move. "Hey, I just want to talk. Come on," he chuckled. I didn't say anything, and I felt like if I even opened my mouth, I might throw up. "Don't be a fucking bitch," he snapped. I glanced back to see that he was catching up to me. He was maintaining a slight distance on purpose, to mess with me, and he appeared to be smirking. "Nice leggings," he said when our eyes met. I was closer to my house now, but I knew that I couldn't actually go inside. I thought about taking my phone out of my backpack to call someone, but I wouldn't be able to take it out, while trying to maintain the distance between myself and the man that was following me. I couldn't risk doing anything that might slow me down, and so I kept walking with no idea as to what I was going to do. Suddenly, I noticed a woman standing across the street, and I felt a sudden rush of relief. She was standing next to a light post, and all I could really see was her silhouette. Her hair was long, and she appeared to be wearing a dress. I looked back at the man who was still following me, but he didn't even seem to notice her. I crossed the street and made my way towards her, hoping that maybe he would see her and leave. Instead, he proceeded to cross the street as well. I looked over at the woman, and as I got closer, I began to notice that there was something off about her. She was standing unusually still, with her hands at her side and slightly hunched over. I noticed she was also standing in a puddle, even though it hadn't rained here in weeks. When I was a few feet away from her, I realized that it wasn't a puddle of water that she was standing in, but rather a puddle of blood. I slowed down, forgetting about the man who was still right behind me. I noticed now that the woman was wearing a nightgown that was covered in blood from the middle of her chest to the bottom of the gown. I could tell that the wound was fresh, since none of her blood has dried yet, and it stuck to parts of her body while it dripped onto the puddle underneath her. There was way too much blood on and around her, and I was fairly certain that there was no way she should even be alive. I stopped walking when I reached the edge of the sidewalk, not really knowing what to do. The woman stayed still as a statue, and I wasn't even sure she was breathing. I had forgotten about the fact that I was being followed, until I felt a hand land over my mouth. I began to move around immediately, trying to get away, and I somehow managed to bite down on one of his fingers. "What the fuck?" he exclaimed, letting go of me long enough for me to move away from him. I looked over at the woman, who had finally lifted her head, and looked towards me. Her face was covered in scratches and bruises, and the whites of her eyes were bright red, almost glowing. I was frozen in place as I stared back at her, until she broke eye contact first, and looked over at the man, taking a step towards him. "Holy shit," he said, finally noticing her. He took a few steps backward, forgetting all about me, and stared at the bleeding, beat-up woman that stood before him. She continued to walk towards him, leaving a trail of blood as she moved. I watched as the man continued to walk backward down the street. Suddenly, she ran at him and jumped onto him, wrapping her legs around his torso and digging her fingers into his eyes. He let out an incredibly loud scream, and I watched as she pulled her fingers back and stuck them into her mouth, cleaning off all the blood. The man fell onto his back, and she fell with him, clasping her fingers together and then lifting her hands up before she swung down on his chest. I heard a sickening crunch, and she began digging her fingers into his skin through his shirt, spreading it open to reveal his insides. She glanced over at me and stopped for a second. "Go home," she said calmly, and I took off. I ran the rest of the way home, locking the door behind me, and then making my way through the house to make sure the windows and doors were secure. I couldn't stop seeing the bleeding woman digging into the man's chest, and I sat on the couch in the dark, trying to get the image out of my head. I felt nauseous and tired, but at the same time, I couldn't help but feel safe, and I don't know how, but I somehow knew that I'd see the bleeding woman again, and I felt safe knowing that she'd be there again if I ever needed her.